Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good wherever you are, and welcome to this SNIA Cloud Storage Technologies presentation. ESG Research, the Hybrid Cloud Tipping Point. So today we are going to be joined by a very special guest speaker, Scott Sinclair of Enterprise Strategy. I'll introduce our panel who will be asking questions during and after the presentation. And I hope that you thoroughly enjoy this slightly unusual for us format of having several people on a presentation, one of whom is doing the presenting and the rest who are doing, if you like, asking questions from their knowledge of and state of the industry. So, very quickly, here are our presenters for today. I'd like to welcome Scott Sinclair of Enterprise Strategy Group. Is it good morning for you, Scott?
Good morning, or good afternoon for me.
Oh, it's good afternoon. There you go. We're all over the globe with this presentation. We're not all in the same room. We're also joined today by Michelle Tidwell. Hello, Michelle.
Hi there, Alex. Good evening for you, or afternoon.
Good, whatever. Good grief, it's late. Michelle is from IBM Marketing, and we're also joined by Mike Jochimson of Caminario. Hi, Mike.
Hello, Alex.
We were going to be joined by Eric Lakin of University of Michigan, but unfortunately Eric can't make it with us today. And myself, Alex McDonald, I'm your host for today and will guide you through this presentation. So, just a few hygiene factors. First of all, during the presentation you may feel that what you're looking at is a little small on your screen. You can increase the size of the presentation to full screen. There's a button on the presentation window that allows you to do that. Secondly, there's two other things I'd like you to do during this presentation. The first thing is to ask us questions. If there's any question you'd like to ask Scott during the presentation, then please do so. That's exactly what this is about. There's a number of us on this presentation asking our questions, but if you have questions, please ask them too in the questions from the audience section. You can enter in your question. And lastly, as we leave the presentation today, there's a little ratings button. I'd like you to press that ratings button and tell us what you think about this presentation. And it scales from 1, I wish I'd been doing something else, this really was awful, all the way up to 5. More, please. This is the kind of thing we really enjoy and like, and that would be excellent if you could do that at the end of the presentation today. So just a quick pointer about the legal notice. Before we get into the details, this is a standard legal disclaimer from SNIA. It's just to remind you that this is a SNIA copyright, and today, because ESG have kindly presented some of their research, this is also ESG's copyright, and there are some conditions here about how we would like you to treat this material. Lastly, there are no warranties with this either. If you go out and make some buying decisions based on our presentation today, and that buying decision turns out to be a complete disaster, we're not responsible. Don't try and find a lawyer to file at us. SNIA itself, anyone who doesn't know who we are, it's a global not-for-profit association dedicated to advancing the adoption of storage technology. We employ a vendor-neutral status. We don't talk about vendor products in these presentations, and we're attempting to develop industry-wide standards for which we enlist the help of subject matter experts like Scott today in our community, and then we provide marketing and promotional programs to aid the adoption of storage technologies. We provide a wide range, an extensive range of education materials on storage technology, and this is one of them. This is an example of the kind of presentations that we do. We've got an entire library of them, and if you go to our website at SNIA.org, you'll find literally in the hundreds of presentations on a variety of storage topics. So that's who we are. Without further ado, just a quick slide on the cloud storage technologies and what we do. We're a subsection or a set of people with a common interest in cloud storage technologies, and we primarily focus on cloud technologies. So, with that as an introduction, and welcoming Steve. Steve, take it away.
Well, hey,
Scott,
thank you very much, Alex.
Who's Steve?
Hey, I'll go by Steve. I'll go by Scott. Anything for you, Alex.
My apologies.
It works. It's always good to kick this off on a mistake. It's only up from here. So I'm very pleased and excited today to come in and present some of our technology. As Alex mentioned, my name is Scott, not Steve Sinclair, Senior Analyst with Enterprise Strategy Group. And just for those of you who may, many of you may have heard of us. Some of you may not have. We're an IT analyst firm with a heavy focus on both research and strategy. Some of you out there listening may be familiar with some of our technology validations that we've done. But today I'm going to focus on the data that we have back from our research arm. And that's really what I'm excited today, and really use this as a sounding board for the panel to ask me questions, and we can get into a pretty good discussion on the data that we're seeing. So what you're going to see is data from two different studies. Here's some of the background of the first study that I'm going to kick off the data with, and then we'll talk about the second study a little later. So this is part of our overall IT 2019 analysis. This study was done in November of last year, so it is very recent. We looked at 600 IT decision makers. These are people, in order to qualify, you had to be someone that bought IT infrastructure. A split between enterprise and mid-market, 70-30, so about 70% enterprise, 30% mid-market. This was a global study, or I guess global as in North America and Western Europe. So there is some things outside of North America in here. We also covered multiple industry verticals across a pretty wide dynamic. And the goal here was to really get an idea of the state of IT. And I think one of the big trends that we saw, which to really kick it off and use as a sounding board for everything else, is this idea that IT isn't getting any easier. So, we asked a simple question: how complex is your IT environment versus what it was 2 years ago? And 2/3 of IT organizations, 66%, are saying it's more complex than it was 2 years ago. Now, the idea here is not the fact that IT is complicated. I think many of you in the audience probably know, hey, this is a complicated job. It requires a tremendous amount of work and planning. To me, the interesting element is the 2 years. 2 years should not be that long of a time frame, and this is something that we are seeing. It should not be that long of a time frame if you think about how long warranties are for infrastructure. But this is something where, relative to just as it was 2 years ago, there's a significant portion of organizations that are saying IT is complex and that complexity is accelerating. On the next slide here, we get some insight into what's driving that complexity. Now, again, many of you in the audience are probably familiar and going to be nodding your heads when you see some of these. But what jumped out to me was really two big themes. And you see it right there on the left on both scale and innovation. So if you look at the top 6 of these things, and I'm going to break these into two different categories. The first category is scale. So if you look at the first 3, the top leaders of what's driving complexity, is we see increase in the number and type of devices. We see this more data. We're collecting more data. People have been complaining about data growth for decades, and I think it's even accelerating today. And then finally, the increase in the number and type of applications. So IT organizations today, as I'm sure many of you, again, are familiar in the audience, are dealing with this scale challenge. Now, scale has always existed. IT has always had to scale with the demands of the business. The new trend that we're seeing, which comes out a little bit in this data, but we have in other data sets that I can share a little bit of, is the rise of the digital economy. The closer that data is tied to business outcomes, IT is not only seen as, today, IT is seen not just as an enabler of business services, it is seen as a creator of business opportunity. And it is that role as a creator that has accelerated the rate of data creation and the types of devices. And now the other interesting element is we've seen this as in the next theme of innovation. So some of these innovations are specifically tied to that role as a business creator, which are the first two here. I guess it'd be number 4 and 5 on my list, which are this rise of emerging technology. So we see machine learning and other types of AI initiatives being undertaken by businesses. And when I say AI and machine learning here, I'm not talking about artificial intelligence tools that help us manage infrastructure. I'm talking about companies that are taking on AI initiatives as a way to leverage their data to, to have some sort of net business benefit. And again, you see things like advanced analytics and even a little blockchain in there as well. The fifth element, or second as part of this theme, is we have a major digital transformation initiative underway. And digital transformation, even though it can be argued as a marketing term, I think the way we defined it and the way the way when I like to think about it honestly is it's this idea that really how can IT become more of a business creator? Let's put some initiatives around that. Let's innovate around that area. And to me, that incremental role is driving IT complexity. And then lastly in this group of 6 is this need to use both on and off-premises data centers, which, this is the cloud group, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about cloud trends in the rest of the deck, but I think this is incredibly compelling because what the cloud was designed to offload IT. It's supposed to make all of our lives easier, and it does to a degree. However, there is a cost to that, and there is complexity that is emerging from organizations having to manage both, having to manage on-premises and public cloud. And we see in our research, there's a paradigm shift that happens within that management, and that paradigm shift is creating complexity. Then I'll move on to the next slide. The other aspect of complexity, which, hopefully should be, maybe a good slide for those of you in the audience, may not, is you can't hire your way out of complexity. You can't just throw money at the problem and try to just throw bodies at it, because at the end of the day, companies are having a problem finding experienced, intelligent people. So this data right here really highlights where the most problematic skill shortages are. Now, many of you in the audience may be looking at this and saying, okay, these are words I need to make sure is on my LinkedIn profile, and that may work for you too. But part of it is also to look at, okay, where are the big costs? How is complexity rearing its head within IT? Cybersecurity is number one. This should surprise no one. It's a very complex problem. Hiring in this area has been very difficult and is something that it's been that way for a number of years, and I expect to continue to be. But IT infrastructure, IT architecture and planning is something that being number 2, I think, is incredibly compelling because it represents all these ideas. IT is more disaggregated than it's ever been in terms of its infrastructure. It has more requirements than it ever has due to the rise of the digital economy, and this is leading to a skill shortage in finding people that can architect and plan properly, and even beating out machine learning and data scientists in terms of overall skill shortages. So again, very much right there in the top value of driving business value. And then for the next slide, we move into that concludes the section on overall IT trends. And now I really want to double click into some of the things that we're seeing in terms of overall public cloud usage and public cloud trends. So real quick, some summary numbers. So again, this is a study that was just done a few months ago. 85% of the organizations we polled leverage the public cloud or public cloud services in some shape or form. Now, this is not just infrastructure as a service. It also includes software as a service or even platform as a service. So, but at the end of the day, what we're seeing is the key takeaway for that 85% number is the cloud is permeated our lives. It is something where if you are not using any sort of cloud service, you are in a significant minority. Speaking of software as a service, which I'm not going to touch on quite a bit because this is more of a infrastructure and cloud related call, but I think it's meaningful, is 67% of IT organizations that we polled have a significant adoption rate, and by significant it means more than 20% of their apps, a significant adoption rate of software as a service. And when you compare that to only 38%, well, I guess these are 2018 numbers, so it would be 5 years prior. So, essentially an increase in almost 30 points in just 5 years. So software as a service is a significant part of the modern IT application environment, and is something that is increasing. Next, what we see is this 56% number. So 56% of digitally native companies. Now, we define digitally native as they've only been around for 10 years or less. So these are newer companies that emerge, their IT organizations emerge within the cloud era, the cloud era, or the time frame of the cloud. And they've identified themselves as having what we classify as a cloud-first policy. Now, a cloud-first policy means that every new application is deployed on the cloud unless someone makes an incredibly compelling case not to do it. And this is so alternative. So when we ask these questions, we give people three options. One is cloud first, which I just defined. The other one is data or on-premises first or data center first, which is the opposite. I'm deploying it in the data center unless someone tells me to move it to the cloud or deploy it on the cloud. And then the third option is, hey, we look at each application, evaluate its merits, and then make the right decision, or make what we believe is the right decision based on our analysis. And so what we do see is we see a very high adoption rate of cloud-first policies or in digitally native companies. And then finally, among infrastructure as a service users, and I'll get to this data a little bit later, 49% or nearly half are using infrastructure as a service to run production apps. Again, I assume many of you in the audience probably know this already, but the bottom line is infrastructure as a service is not just for test and dev and backup. This is something that has become an area where production applications are. It is a layer for production applications today. Now, focusing specifically on infrastructure as a service, one of the things that we've seen a rise in is its adoption over the past few years. So this is something we've been tracking since 2011, and as of the end of 2018, so a few months ago, 58% of IT organizations are leveraging infrastructure as a service, according to our research. Now, again, this is something that we've seen increase nearly every year, and up from 17% back in 2011. So typically on the adoption curve, we see software as a service tend to lead the pack in terms of overall adoption, which makes sense, given software as a service includes some very popular applications such as Salesforce or Office 365, but as well as many other things. But this is something that that infrastructure service continues to rise as well. Now we look at the drivers of infrastructure as a service. So one of the questions we had is, among infrastructure as a service users, what types of workloads are you running on your infrastructure service? Are you running on the cloud? And this year, the number one answer, the most commonly identified answer among these, is running production applications. Now, production applications is a very broad term. It applies to a number of different things. So I could see people saying that's pretty vague, but at the end of the day, it denotes a very important role, which says these companies have identified the cloud as this is something where it is a production level, it is an enterprise level infrastructure, and we can run production level apps on it. And it's something that we've seen increases over the past 5 years that you see there from our data in 2015, and beating out what's behind it, such as queries for business intelligence, test and dev round out the top three, and then you get to the repository for backup and archive, things like accommodating workloads spikes, and then DR targets, and then temporary compute for time-limited projects. We need to spin something up and do some analysis, and then probably spin it back down a little later. And again, these are not the only, I want to preface this data by saying it's not the only use cases for cloud, obviously, but these are some major trends that tend to get bounded about, and I think it's very important to show that the production level is beating out many of these other things that tend to get associated with infrastructure as a service. Now I'll move on to my next slide. Is there a question?
Yeah. Hi, Scott. It's Michelle.
Hey, Michelle.
I was just wondering on disaster recovery in particular, is that still viewed as an important use case for hybrid cloud? Because at one time it was kind of up in the top few percentage categories.
It is, and I think, you bring up a very valid point of, how to read this data. I went back as I was prepping for this conversation and looked back at all the percentages of 2015, not just production data. And what we saw back then was, backup and archive was the number one answer with a bullet, and that was by far and away high. And test and dev was number two, and DR was number three. Now, what's interesting is, so you may look at this and say, well, wait a minute, DR is now, what is that, sixth? So that means it's lower. Well, on one hand, we have two different factors that are working for us here. Number one is the numbers overall have increased. So DR was, I want to say, what was it? It was 30 to 35% back in 2015, and now it's about the same, a little higher at 37. But also, what we've seen is a dramatic increase in overall infrastructure as a service adoption. So on one hand, you could say, well, it's not, the rate of people that use infrastructure as a service for DR is staying about the same, increasing a little bit from 30 to 35 to 37 or 32 to 37. But what we've seen though is, if I go back to the previous slide, is a pretty strong adoption in terms of overall cloud. So we've gone from 41% of people using cloud to now 58%. So a 17% increase in the number of organizations that are using infrastructure as a service. So there's a multiplier effect there. So DR is still a very important workload. Test and dev is test and dev is becoming an even more important workload. It was 38%, now it's 47%. But I think what's compelling is the production. This just puts more of an emphasis on production apps being a really interesting, compelling option, because not only is it getting that increase in just the benefit of overall cloud adoption, but it's accelerating in terms of its importance. And also, production apps, honestly, is I would argue is a vaguer term than disaster recovery, and therefore it's it's more likely to be far more applicable to different to various companies. So it would not surprise me that overall, eventually, production apps ends up leading, just because the term itself is very vague. But I think it highlights just how much it's risen in recent years, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does, and I think it, an interesting side point here is the absolute numbers have obviously gone up as these use cases have grown in infrastructure as a service. So the percentages here actually represent more absolute number usage than it did 5 years ago.
Exactly, and thank you for absolute number would have been the ideal term for me to have used in my answer, but yes, absolutely, you're right.
Hey, Scott, this is Mike. Another quick clarifying question on disaster recovery. Is that implying that these companies are building a complete DR environment in the public cloud, which can serve as an active failover for very quick recovery? Is it more data DR, where the data is being replicated out to that target and can be quickly replicated back?
So that's a great distinction question. I think one of the complexities with doing quantitative analysis is, at the end of the day, you can, as specifically as you word the question, there is some faith that's involved that someone read the question and made the appropriate decision. Now, I would articulate disaster recovery as your first option. Is I'm leveraging the cloud, so if I have some sort of on-site disaster, I have my data in the cloud already, and I can spin up apps in the cloud very quickly, or they're ready to go as a disaster recovery site. And I would use that as a separation from, for example, a repository for backup data, where it's just a secondary copy of my backup, and then eventually if something bad happens on site, I can use that data to come back on site from my disaster. That being said, it would not surprise me if some people that selected disaster recovery didn't have a mature, modern, full disaster recovery solution in the cloud.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right. Cool. Great questions. Any others before I move on? All right. Going one. All right. We'll move on, and if we think of some, we can always come back. So as much as cloud and hybrid, we talk about cloud adoption, infrastructure as a service adoption is increasing dramatically. The other big trend that we're seeing is multi-cloud. So hybrid cloud, so first off, I absolutely understand that the terms hybrid cloud and multi-cloud get thrown around a ton by a ton of different people to mean different things, and I could spend an hour talking about all the nuances of how people use different definitions, but I don't think that'd be very interesting. The way we're talking about multi-cloud is, are you actually using multiple infrastructure as a service providers right now? And the answer is yes. So 76% of infrastructure as a service users are using more than one. Now, there's a myriad of drivers for this. One of the top ones is, different cloud providers tend to be, differentiating on different types of workloads and different types of applications, and that's the way organizations look to adopt multi-cloud. Other ways have been, we looked at, different organizations and how they adopted the cloud, and really just how organizations went to their overall cloud journeys. And then that's the end of the cloud data as well as the overall IT data. Now I'm going to jump to some data from a separate study. But before I do that, let me just double check and see if there's any other questions from the panel.
Yeah, Scott, we've just got one, which is just a comment, but it's a comment worth commenting on, if you like. Since this is infrastructure as a service, then data replication to the cloud, I think, is meant to be, would be considered backup as it consumes storage rather than compute, unless they have data protection apps running in the cloud. So I think that comes back to this data and compute question.
And I think that's a good point. So when we talk about infrastructure as a service, we're also talking about compute as well. So we're using that as a term to differentiate it from a software as a service versus Office 365, for example. Just to name a random one, and I know that one because of familiarity. But so it does imply some compute, but I think that's a very valid point because, and it relates back to Mike's question earlier, which is, we put this as you have a DR implementation or a cloud-based DR solution, but I've seen, depending on which vendor you talk to in different solutions, there's varying degrees of what that looks like. That may be where all the apps are running on infrastructure as a service, and you have all the data, and it's mirrored or closely mirrored as a retention copy, and it's ready to go if there's any sort of disaster. It may be that, or it may be where they have some sort of plan, where they have the data protection software up in the cloud, but they haven't spun up the apps yet, and they have the ability to do that. There's a number of different ways in which it can manifest itself, and I'm not a DR expert by any means, but there is some vagueness to the question. I think it's very important to acknowledge. But we do, when we talk about infrastructure service, we are including, the compute services as well, not just storage.
Okay, thanks, Scott. And just a reminder to the audience, keep asking questions. We're here to answer them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now some of the fun part, which not to say that past part wasn't fun, but so this study I call Tipping Point: Finding the Hybrid Cloud Balance. Now, this was a separate study, so not to be confused with the data before. This is completely different. We did this about middle of last year. And how this arose, so I kind of had the background up there, is I was talking to various CIOs and leaders, and they were, every now and then I would hear someone mention, we brought a workload back from the cloud, and we're doing this, we ran this thing, so we now some sort of workload or application that was running on public cloud is now running back in our data center. I said, that's interesting. I wonder if that's really happening. So we put out a poll last year and said, hey, are you doing this? Or have you brought a workload back from infrastructure as a service, from the cloud, infrastructure as a service, and now you're running it back in the data center? And 41% of IT organizations said, yeah, we've done it at least once. And so that to me was really interesting. Why is that happening? What's going on? So we did a separate study just on those people. So we found 350 organizations that pulled at least one workload back from the cloud, and they were across multiple industries, a split of enterprise mid-market of 75-25. And again, just to reiterate, excuse me, every single one of these organizations pulled a workload back from the cloud, which means this data is a little different than the data I presented previously. While the previous data was meant, the previous data points were meant to provide a snapshot of what is happening within IT by looking at 600 random organizations and pulling them together and looking at their insight and saying, hey, what can we extrapolate to greater IT as a whole? This is different. This data cannot be extrapolated to the greater IT as a whole because we're focusing in on one specific subset, just people that pulled things back. And the goal of this data, I kind of list some of the how to use it. So again, it's not representative of all IT organizations. But the goal of this was to say, hey, there are some organizations that if they pulled something back, it means that I made an assumption that they're fairly mature in their usage of public cloud to have a workload running so long on there, they made a decision to come back. And that gives them some level of experience. And what can we learn from these people based on their decisions to keep some things in the cloud and some things back, and figure out how can we take those lessons and apply them to organizations that may be earlier in their hybrid cloud journey. The other thing, too, that I get, I presented this data a few times, the other thing I get all the time is I've had organizations say, this is anti-cloud data. You just hate the cloud. I said, no, actually, the data here is not anti-cloud. 86% of participants also identified they're completely and mostly satisfied with their cloud providers. And I think that's something else to keep in mind here. This data is not saying, and I'll hit on it no more times, this is not saying the cloud service failed. Often it highlights complexities and things that exist within that paradigm shift of moving from of how organizations and companies are embracing the cloud and things that they would change. And I'm trying to be vague while I set the stage because I have data later. But anyway, that's the goal of this study, and I'll reiterate it as often as I can. So if I become where you've heard this comment too many times, just know I do it because I want to make sure we're clear on the data itself. So along those lines, what we saw is among organizations that pulled a workload back, this balancing activity is very selective. So 77%, almost 80% of organizations said they only pulled a workload back a handful of times. And a handful, we're talking 2, 3, 4, somewhere around there, so not very many times. Then the other aspect is, versus the 23% that were in this many times scenario is, now you're talking 5, 6, 7, even higher, or more. So where they've pulled workloads back multiple times. But again, we're not talking, there was no one here in the study that said we pulled everything back. That never occurred. Even when it did happen, it was always selective. Just how selective it was is something we showed up. Now, there were some there were some very interesting trends and factors that came out of the data that I think is very important to point out. So first, 70% of these organizations said at least one of the workloads they pulled back was procured on public cloud from a group outside of IT. Now, to me, that's really compelling because we've done other studies where we've said, hey, how do you guys procure infrastructure as a service? And in that, 2/3 of organizations said, hey, it goes through IT. So the fact that there is a 70% are saying, hey, we went outside of IT, then to me that's a very compelling number. That, hey, something is happening when organizations go to the cloud without involving IT. The other really compelling aspect was not only were more than half of these participants cloud first, which I talked about again, but just to reiterate, this means that a new workload goes to the cloud whether you're unless someone dives in front of it and stops it. But cloud first companies were 3 times more likely to identify they pulled many workloads back than companies that said, hey, we equally consider the cloud or and on-premises. We equally consider those 2 infrastructure deployment models and look at the applications before we deploy. And I think that's what it is. And one of the terms I've used before, it's not on the slide, but I've used before, is this idea of cloud exuberance. Is companies in their rush to adopt the cloud, there may be some due diligence that might get missed. And I'm not saying the due diligence is right for every app, but I think that's where the nuances in how costly it is to come back start to show up.
Hey, Scott.
Yes.
It's Michelle again. I was just wondering, do you think that there's a bigger opportunity now in this hybrid public cloud market for professional services, given that more analysis needs to be done on workload requirements?
Absolutely, I do. And I have some of this later on, Michelle, but I think that's one of the things that we're leading towards is deploying and managing workloads on the cloud. There is some nuances that are different from deploying and managing them on premises. And in understanding how that applies to your individual workloads is important. Oh, and you brought up another interesting idea. Is one of the things that you would think would have shown up, I don't have it on a slide, is that, and a question I get all the time is there some workloads that just work on the cloud and other workloads that just work on premises? And what's interesting is no. Is the workloads people pull back are a wide variety of every workload you could possibly imagine, and the workloads that people move to the cloud are a wide variety of everything you could possibly imagine. So what we're seeing is it's not that some workloads work on the cloud, it's that it's a combination of the workloads, how they're utilized, and the organization, the expertise, and what's going on in the data center itself that drives a lot of these overall maybe that drives some of the decisions, but also drive the overall effectiveness of the hybrid cloud environment. So that actually increases the need for these types of services simply because you can't just sit there and use any good rule of thumb that, X database works really well in the cloud, X, file share works really well on premises or something like that. So it is very custom to your own environment.
Yeah, and I would assume that picking the right type of back-end infrastructure that's available on the public cloud would be important because cloud providers have a lot of different tiers of, compute and storage capability, right? So matching that with the application is going to be important.
I would assume that as well. We didn't dive too far into that in this study, but being familiar with the services, each of the major cloud providers has areas where they have expertise, and that creates some differentiation, and it also creates some nuances in how different workloads work. Any other questions before we move on? All right. So when we ask organizations, okay, why did you move the workload back? So number one answer is data security, and that means a number of different things. It included, and this is something that we had later on that I didn't think we'd have a ton of time to really dive into, but it includes things like data sensitivity. We had sensitive data out on the cloud that, due to our rules or some other new rules, didn't make sense. We had to make sure that it was on premises. Some of it meant we have certain security requirements in how we validate whether or not our infrastructure is secure, and leveraging the public cloud made it difficult to validate. There were also some instances of data breaches, so I didn't want to, say that never occurred, but that happened as well. That also was part of that number. Cost as well showed up, and now cost could mean a number of different things. In some cases, it was the overall cost of the service was far more than we anticipated, and sometimes it was less the overall cost, but it was the cost predictability. And I know some cloud providers have done some efforts to try to minimize the impact of predictability, but that reared its head in some of these cases. Now, again, this is the other thing, too. I want to replay it here, is this does not mean, when you look at this slide, it does not mean that something like Bright Talk's not, let me see my number, but I think it's 38%. It does not mean that 38% of IT organizations had a security issue with the cloud. What it means is that among a small, this percentage of organizations that pulled something back, and they pulled back only a small percentage of their workloads, among those workloads, 38% of people said one of those workloads came back due to some sort of security issue, some sort of security-related issue. So another way to put it is, even among the companies that pulled it back, 62% or whatever that is didn't have any security issue, or 75% didn't have any cost issues, for example. So it is very much, this is not saying cloud has these issues. It's just saying, hey, these are things that in these subsets where people pulled back, these are issues that they ran into. Cost, again, regulatory compliance shows up, and then you get into some of the other aspects. So, developer wanted it somewhere. Availability shows up a few times, and then there's it's kind of an eye chart, but there's a number of different things on there. Any questions?
Hi, Scott. Yeah, this is Mike. Back on security, I know earlier in the presentation you talked about cybersecurity being one of the primary skills that are in demand that are very tough to fill, and now we're talking about security being one of the reasons why applications or workloads get pulled back from the cloud. While I'm sure there's no direct correlation between those, what kind of insights can you talk about in terms of security, and if you're going to have security issues putting apps in the cloud, can you necessarily resolve those bringing them back on premise if finding security resources is the biggest challenge?
That's a wonderful point. I thought for a second maybe I should just say security's hard and just say that's the key takeaway, because that's part of it. But it is to that element. Companies are so focused on cybersecurity now that absolutely certain companies are going to the cloud because, and that's something that I don't have in this data, but we saw that movement to the cloud was partly due to, hey, I feel more comfortable with security in the cloud than I feel on premises. Now, other companies said the opposite. I feel more confident in what I have on premises than what I have within security. So there's a difference based off of, again, it relates very much to the organization itself. But I would say there's a couple macro trends that are happening here. Is number one is security overall is difficult, and people are finding they can't hire enough security professionals. And while sometimes they want to use the cloud, we are seeing some instances where people are coming back. But again, this is still a very small subset. This is not representative of the entire sample. So what I think I would say is maybe a good way to take away is not the fact that the cloud has security issues that are causing people to come back. It's the fact that security and costs are two of the most important things with IT infrastructure, and those tend to be the things that will drive a major change. And so that's the way that I tend to think about it. Is these are the really important things to where if you get them, if you're off from your previous analysis, it will force you to change. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Any other questions before I move on?
Tell you what, Scott, when you get to the end of this, I'm going to beat you up with the audience questions. How does that sound?
Oh, well, see, that's, you know, I can jump on some right here. So let's see. So one question that I'm looking right now is the apps in the cloud, were they all infrastructure as a service apps, or did they comprise a mix? So that's a good question. On that question specifically, this study did have a mix. So we looked at both workloads that came back from infrastructure as a service and workloads that came back from software as a service. And it was honestly about there was a pretty even, almost a third split of people that just pulled things back from infrastructure service and people that pulled back from software as a service and people that pulled back from both. So there was a split. For this question, I'm focusing on infrastructure as a service because I think it's appropriate to this conversation. I have some other data on both here in a little bit later. So hopefully that answers that question. On cloud first versus cloud exuberant, do folks mind the term cloud first? I've seen companies define it along a continuum of meanings. So this was part of a study, and we did a lot of work to define it. So when you took the study, it defined it as I said, you deploy it on the cloud unless all new application deployments go on the cloud unless someone makes a compelling argument not to. I've not seen any negative response to that term, but that is something for us to keep in mind.
I like the phrase cloud exuberant.
Yep. Exuberance is my term, so I've not written it anywhere, so people may come back at me. That's my term. So if you don't like it, that's okay. I'm trying to come up with something that expresses the cloud has a tremendous benefits,
yeah,
and it's leading people to, all run towards it, and sometimes, it didn't make sense for one of the particular apps or a couple of the particular apps. Sorry, I cut you off there.
No, that's okay. I was just agreeing with you. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good. And then, these were a breakdown between mid-market and enterprise workloads. Now here, just because of how we were cutting the data, it made sense to combine both software as a service and infrastructure as a service. But again, data security was high. Again, it's very important. But what was interesting here was cost, very much more, far higher in the mid-market responses and in enterprise responses. And again, you could argue, how much of it is, okay, these are issues people ran into, or how much of this is important aspects of the application that caused people to move? And among enterprise organizations, we saw them far less likely to go to the cloud for cost in the first place, and therefore they're far less likely to move to the cloud for cost. With mid-market, we see them far more likely to move to the cloud for cost, and because of that, they're far more likely to move back if they don't get those cost benefits. So to me, that's the key takeaway there. There's a couple other things. Regulatory and compliance was very high. This on-premises serves as a staging area. That's something that was interesting that showed up. It was very much specific to organizations leveraging infrastructure as a service that were running apps that were procured via the software as a service portal on an infrastructure as a service provider. So there was an interesting workload selection there that drove that group. Let's see. Any questions on that before I move?
There's one question from the audience, which I think is quite an interesting one as well. The public cloud is a different security paradigm. The default is usually no access, which legacy users find hard, so they tend to go the easy route and just grant much more access than is required. Does that explain some of the security concerns that IT organizations face?
I couldn't agree more. I think that that is very well put, and that is accurate. I mean, I've mentioned a couple times the paradigm shift, but this idea of, back when, in my early days of IT, and this will show how old I am, I guess, people would ask me about digital security. I said, well, we got a lock on the door. because it was very small, and the only way to access anything was you had to be in the room. You had to be in. There were only a couple offices that you had to be in to access any of the data. And now we have in where your data is leveraged very much at or is leveraged anywhere in the world, and it's stored possibly anywhere in the world in the cloud. There are tremendous paradigm shifts, and that's an excellent point. And I've seen some cloud providers start to address those sorts of security problems by trying to put some sort of analytics or artificial intelligence involved to scan your buckets and look at the security. For example, you look at the security settings and try to give you some analysis, but to help in that. But it is definitely a paradigm shift, and it is something that is needs to be focused on, I think, a little more than it already is. Which actually sets up my next slide, which hits at, so we ask organizations, what would you do differently? So you ran into this issue, you incurred some costs in moving everything back, and we looked, and people hit costs in moving stuff back, and they had to buy new infrastructure. So these tended to be costly endeavors. And so we said, what would you do? And to Michelle, to your question, number one answer, we need help. We need to leverage a consultative cloud assessment service to figure this out, or work with some sort of third-party integrator, some sort of partner to help us figure out how to move our apps to the cloud. But then, you follow that and you see, hey, we need to better understand our data sensitivity. I've long joked that, file storage in the data center for many organizations turned into a giant junk drawer of everything. And it was never really okay, but it was fine if it was all within a data center and behind a certain level of security. But when organizations start moving stuff to the cloud, you start running into challenges. Again, and then you get performance requirements, availability requirements. So these are things that, taking from people that have encountered these move-backs, these are things to consider as you're evaluating workloads in which you're going to move in the future. Now, and I think kind of the final point on this slide is at the very bottom, at 20%, you have we're going to avoid using this cloud service provider again. And right below that, you're going to have, we might not deploy this workload type on public cloud services. So, and that's not to call those out as being high. It's actually to call them out because they're low. The majority of the takeaways were not this workload doesn't work on the cloud, or this cloud provider is someone we're never going to work with again. The majority of these responses, which again were a subset of everyone that is out there in IT, are saying the way we interact, the way we started our hybrid cloud journey, we made some mistakes that we should remedy internally. I mean, if you look at all these, I think the top 5, or really this top 6, are all things that the company should be doing. And the bottom 2 have to do with the app, and then the final one has to do with the cloud provider. And I said it was the last comment, but I guess I had one more, is cloud exit strategy. Even though it's, 7th on the list or 6th on the list, 29%, it is something to think about. If you do have a high-value workload that is mission-critical and very important that you're moving to the cloud, it's good to do the analysis up front, but it's also good to think about, hey, if we had to move that back, what would the time and cost be, and is that acceptable? And then, it's important to have all those things in any risk assessment.
And Scott, would you say that therefore selecting solutions that provide, say, data liberation, in other words, not getting locked into a single provider is important, so clients have flexibility for that exit strategy, or to perhaps move to a different provider?
I think that's a great comment, Michelle. I would always advocate offering in any sort of app development as much infrastructure flexibility and as much use of standards as you possibly can. Very few people, even myself as an analyst, but even the people I talk to that are architecting these solutions, can sit down and tell you, with any sort of strong degree of certainty, what IT is going to look like 5 years from now, or maybe even 3 years from now. I think that is the more you can do to allow yourself flexibility in your deployments and how you're able to adjust is incredibly valuable, especially when it comes to, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, but especially when it comes to data, as we talked a lot about, that high data volumes were driving complexity. But data is very time consuming to move large sets of data around the world. Very time consuming and very costly. It will always be. It's going to be very difficult for that problem to ever be solved. And so understanding that before you make these moves, or as you make the moves to comprehend a few years down, I think is only in your best interest. It's not saying that you don't make the move. It's just saying you need to understand the implications and give yourself as many options as you possibly can.
Yep.
Mike, any questions for Scott?
To pile on to Michelle's last question, you talked earlier about using that repatriation simply as a staging point moving from cloud to cloud. I would think over time we'll see more of that activity, whether it's repatriating back on premise and out to another cloud or directly from cloud to cloud. So I think Michelle's question was absolutely critical, because you don't want to build for a specific environment and get locked in, and so cloud portability becomes a very critical deciding point when you are either designing apps or putting apps into the cloud environment. And so what advice can you give to customers, whether they're legacy enterprises or even startups who are building cloud native applications, to accommodate that?
So I absolutely agree with your first statement, I absolutely agree with your statement, which is, this need to design for multi-cloud. Do not lock yourself into one cloud-based architecture. From a macro standpoint, I would say the major cloud providers are still defining their own trajectories. I mean, they're building out their services, but they're also finding out how can we differentiate among each other. So it's, there are going to be new services and new things that you might want to have access to on a different cloud provider, 2-3 years that you want the ability to take advantage of. Now, the question is, how do you go about that? So the more, I have more of an infrastructure background than I do an app dev background, so I can talk a little bit about this to be dangerous. But essentially, the more that you can leverage standards, the more you can focus on that, the more that you can use some sort of abstraction layer, whether it's virtualization or the usage of Kubernetes and containers. I think is something that I've seen in terms of app modernization that has driven a tremendous amount of flexibility within these types of environments. But there's other considerations for those. I think that at a macro level, those get into various tactical execution elements. But I think at a macro level, I think what has to take place at IT is an organizational change, and I think this is something that doesn't get talked about enough, is for decades, traditional data center technology was managed almost in an aggregate format. Do we have enough storage and do we have enough compute for everything we're doing? Should we add more storage? Should we add more compute? Leveraging the cloud becomes very much a specific application-to-application conversation. And organizations, in my mind, have never done enough to understand the elements of what the specific applications need and forecast those, as well as figuring out how to expedite and understanding what their overall application environment is and their trajectory. And I think that's something that will become more focused or be focused upon more in the future.
Great. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Scott. Scott, I'm afraid we've run out of time today. That was absolutely fascinating. I know Michelle's got several questions for you, but just to get those in context, we're going to ask those anyway, but we'll ask them and answer them on our blog. We've got a Q&A that we'll put out there on SNIA-Cloud.com. So if you could rate this webcast for us as you leave today, I'd like to thank Scott for his excellent work today in taking us through some of the tipping points through how hybrid cloud infrastructures, to Michelle and for Mike in joining me today in quizzing Scott. If you could rate the webcast as you leave, that would be absolutely fantastic. Comments are always welcome. And you will find that we have a presentation copy up there as a PDF, and I'm putting it in the announcement section at the moment. You should be able to see it very shortly, and you can pick up the copy of the presentation that's been freshly posted. Thank you very much today for your help, Scott. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Mike. And thank you to our audience for joining us today on this presentation. Goodbye.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye.